therapist asks me where I am from, and I tell her that I come from the place where the valleys of western Wisconsin touch the Mississippi River, where the kids drive their tractor to school and park them next to the Mercedes Benz. I tell her about the bend that marks the beginning of my neighborhood, the street that's named after my next door neighbor, how if you climb to the top of Granddad's Bluff, you can stand underneath an American flag and see three states all at once. If you know where to look, you can see all these things from the highway as you're passing through. I tell her that I come from a place that is perpetually in between, always in transition, but never changing much at all. She asks me about my childhood, and I tell her about my elementary school playground, how the basketball court had a map of the world painted in bright colors on the asphalt, how the big kids always took over the best play equipment, but the lowest level belonged only to the kindergartners. I tell her about my first day of kindergarten. I'm 5 years old, and the best spot on the playground is the big red pickup truck that is planted on the wood chips on the far side across from the school. But nobody is there in the truck by the time I get there. Instead, everyone is huddled beneath the truck's underbelly. There, tucked into the empty space where the tires are supposed to be, is a cluster of baby bunnies. And I had never seen anything so small before. And the first boy I would ever have a crush on reaches out his hand and picks one of them up gently before the teachers can catch him. And when they find us, we are huddled together, passing the tiny miracles from one hand to the next like a secret. They told us not to touch them, but we couldn't bear not to. They said that touching the bunnies would get our scent all over them, that when their mothers returned, she wouldn't be able to recognize them. We put them back where we found them, but the damage had already been done. When we arrived to the playground the next morning, all of the bunnies had died. I tell my therapist that this is my first experience with grief. The therapist asks me if I'm spiritual, and I tell her about the day of my baptism. I don't remember any of it, but in the pictures, the light splinters through the stained glass windows to turn everything a light shade of blue. And my grandfather had held me against the white robes that gathered at his belly while I screamed, red-faced and shaking my tiny fist in the air, a little bit angry even then, not trusting really the grace that was being offered to me. I am 8 months old and wrapped in white, a promise of both grace and expectation. I am 8 years old, and my best friend and I are stripping the seeds off of the long prairie grass that surrounds the playground like a white picket fence. We gather the seeds in our palm and blow them into the air, sending them off like wishes between us. I tell her that I think this is the first time that I ever prayed. I'm 10 years old, and my best friend and I are going to Bible camp for the first time, and I am terrified, but she holds my hands as we splash in the cool waters of our private Jordan, and we are both so alive and so loved. I tell my therapist that this is the place where I am from too, that yes, I am spiritual, that on my best days it is all that I am, and on my worst days it is all that I hope to be. My therapist asks me about my parents, and I tell her about the pizza store in downtown Minneapolis where my parents shared their first kiss. How that pizza store is quite literally the place that I come from. I tell her that I worked in my dad's store for 10 years. I tell her about the voice in my head that has been my companion for as long as I can remember, the voice which is also my mother, the one who tells me how to be a nice girl. I tell her about Minnesota nice, how I have inherited an entire culture of niceties, a type of homegrown ethics that says that you are responsible for everyone else's reaction to you. I tell her that Minnesota nice is easy to identify but hard to notice, never taking up too much space, a language made up entirely of subtext. Minnesota nice taught me to do what I'm told with a grin and a curtsy and not take up too much space. I tell her about all the things my hometown has given me, how these things were also my parents. I tell her that I'm thankful. I cannot tell if I am telling the truth or not. At 14, when a brain tumor the size of a baseball was found at the base of my best friend's skull, everyone was so nice about it. The thing about cancer, though, is that there's nothing nice about it. The niceties and empty theodicies flew around me like accusations and took all the air out of the room. When Audra died a year later, after we had found the cancer, she asked that we all wear bright colors to her funeral, like we were going to a child's birthday party. And I guess in some ways we were. The casket remained closed. Everyone knew what had happened here, but nobody could bear to look it in the face. My therapist says, this must be why I've come to therapy. And I tell her about the last time I was in an office like this one. I'm 15, sitting across from a therapist who looks like she does, and I start to tell her about all the ways an older man has been hurting me. When she cuts me off and advises me not to finish my story, tells me that I am describing something illegal, and if I admit any more of my relationship to her, she will have to report it. Are you sure you want to make this a whole thing? She had asked me. Minnesota Nice is averse to conflict. I tell the new therapist that the man who was hurting me loved the fact that I was a nice girl, thought it was fun to take something innocent and turn it into something that wasn't. I tell her that the first time he raped me, I apologize. The apologies fall out of me before I even know that I am doing it, lay scattered on the floor, marking the path of every decision I make. I have learned that there is always something I should feel sorry about. If I am responsible for how others react to me, I think that I must be responsible for this too. I tell the therapist that I didn't speak for weeks after he left my hometown. How the grief of losing him and losing Audra had rendered me speechless. How nobody had told me that grief sounded so much like silence. The therapist tells me to return to my body. And instead, I return to the kindergarten playground. I tell her how at 15, I had already learned that grief and sex were two sides of the same coin. How I wanted so desperately to feel anything other than the raw sting of grief in my stomach. How suddenly I was in love with a small new boy. How we would park his red pickup truck on top of the map that was printed on the asphalt and sit on the hood of his car, chain smoking cigarettes and listening to heavy metal, kissing scraped knees and hands, all the scars left on our bodies from playing too much. And the scars on his body are in the shape of train tracks down his forearm. I remember feeling jealous of the way that he was allowed to wear all of his pain on his sleeve like that. We play new games on old wood chips. I cannot stop thinking about the dead bunnies, about all the things a touch can take away. We practice making clouds with our breath until the sky feels endless again. And I tell her about the boy who came after that and the one who came after that, how popular and desirable my damage had made me. The therapist asks me if I have ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, if I've ever been medicated for that mental illness. I tell her how at 14, I was given a prescription for both birth control and Zoloft, and that I've been taking them both ever since, religiously, holding them side by side on my tongue like Holy Eucharist, a ritual of the body and holding things in. It is 10 years later. I have not filled my prescriptions. I stay in bed for weeks, all of the years of holding unraveling like a loose thread. I bleed through my sheets, unexpected like at 14, and I forgive myself for the girl that I was, for the girl that I am and will continue to be. And I let myself bleed. And for the first time, I do not apologize. When I tell my therapist about all the blood, she is not sure what to say, and the sound of her silence is familiar to me. I'm 22 and have just moved as far away from the places I am from as my 2003 Camry would take me. On the first day of my new job, I walk to the corner of Hyde and Golden Gate, and the buildings all seem to lean in to get closer to me. Broken needles catch in the cracks in the sidewalk, the orange and silver shimmering against the grime of the street. All the people are swaying, huddled into all the empty spaces between where one building meets another. When the therapist asks me what I do for a living, I tell her about the day that we decide to plant flowers outside the gate to our garden. How the sun had warmed the sidewalks, and nobody had died that day. Nothing had grown on the city street in years, but on this day, we plant flowers anyways, in big cement boxes drilled into the sidewalks so nobody will steal them. And with dirt under our fingernails, we scrape the graffiti from the front of our building. What I mean is, we try to make everything new again, which is to say, we pray in the only way we know how. Months later, my favorite client, Elvin, runs to my office for a safe place to die. I can't breathe, he tells me. And when his dark skin turns blue before I can even call for help, I perform CPR for 5 minutes, breathing air from my lungs into his. I think about the boy with the red pickup truck, making clouds with our breath. I couldn't save either of them in the end. A week after Elvin dies, I'm cleaning out his dirty apartment while his only friend whistles Amazing Grace on the sidewalk below. And a text message flashes across the screen behind my eyes asking if I'd heard about Alec. And the train track arms, and I hadn't thought about him for years, really, when I find out that he has died. I do not go to the funeral. I guess I never really knew Alec like that. But I do start smoking again, like I've forgotten what to do with all my breath. I tell my therapist all of this, and she tells me that she will see me at a reduced cost. When I decide that I've lost too much and leave one job for another, I continue to see her every Monday. I refill my prescriptions. I practice leaving the places that built me once more. I'm 24 and I'm sitting in traffic while the sky burns pink through the fog that holds the city like a faithful companion. The commute from Oakland to Bayview is long, and when I arrive to work that day, the kids are already waiting for me in the teen center. My Nisha tells us that she has been working on a new song and unapologetically spits so many motherfuckers into the microphone that I lose track of whose mother she is even talking about. But I know that she has been writing about her mother, her real mother. And I also know that she is trying on the hand-me-downs that have been given to her, falling off her shoulders, still stretched out by the heritage of all the people who wore this righteous anger before her. And this, too, is familiar to me. I write poetry with the kids, and they tell me that I will never understand them. And I remember what it is like to be 14, how nobody did understand, really, and I do not try to convince them they are wrong. Instead, I tell all the kids that I love them before sending them out onto the corner of 3rd and Oakdale. I watch them hang their limbs loosely from the rails of the bus and off of each other's shoulders. I watch all the things they have to teach me about being unafraid. Months later, when we stop gathering in person and all the kids I love are in places where I cannot be, I did watch the video of the murder. And the names of those who have died roll around my tongue like orange Tic Tacs: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin. I think about Alvin, the kid who, mistaken for a grown man, was jumped for crossing 3rd Street on the way to my music studio. I think about the way the kids sprint down the hallway to my classroom to tell me that somebody else's father has died. They show me their bruised knuckles, wearing their swollen lips and black eyes like badges of honor, proof that they have fought for something and come out the other side. And the music twists and boils inside me. The metaphors and platitudes crumble as pillars of salt and cover the ground outside of the corner store, where flowers and candles and beat-up Jordans hold place as we wait to bury our dead. The corner store, which is also a church. And the video of the murder is shot 5 blocks from the pizza store where all of my cousins work. And I watch from halfway across the country as a city where my parents shared their first kiss, a place I once stood, burns. Minnesota Nice appears on my social media feeds like a friend I had long since forgotten, wishes we would protest in a way that was more convenient. Minnesota Nice doesn't appreciate all the looting and rioting, doesn't think anyone should be taking up too much space anyways, but I am not the nice girl anymore. And I'm marching down Broadway from my tiny apartment in downtown Oakland to the corner of Thomas L. Berkeley Way, when two kids who look like the ones I've committed my life to are screaming for me to help a man who looks like every client I ever had, and he is lying on the street, unresponsive. The boys tell me that they think he is overdosing, and I run to him with a naloxone that I keep in my purse for situations such as these, and I try to save his life. Hundreds of police officers are crowded on the street around me, unresponsive. Black Lives Matter, the protesters yell, as I ask the cop standing over me to help me perform CPR, and he does not make eye contact with me. He remains unmoved, arms crossed, unresponsive. When the paramedics arrive 5 minutes later, I am not allowed to know where they are taking the man. And when the cop tells me to step off, I am unresponsive. If you don't have anything nice to say nothing at all, I guess. And as I am walking home, the police officer begins arresting the protesters that line the street, the bodies that sway, and I think about Elvin and Alec and the man on the street corner and my Nisha's bruised knuckles and me at 14, which is to say, I think about all the people I couldn't save. I arrive home that night to my lover's body open to me on the bed like a gift I don't deserve, but I still receive it as such. And he is safe. And as the black ropes of his arms pull me into his chest, I can feel the blood pulse beneath his skin with the power of somebody who has had to earn every heartbeat. And my purple heart is pressed into his, bruised in all the same places, and I run my fingers over his face, gently. I think about how all of this is prayer. When I pray that night, I imagine God in coffee-colored skin, as tear gas curls in through the open window and flashbangs light up the sky on the next street over. And we both leave pieces of ourselves tangled in the bed sheets when we go outside to smoke a cigarette. My phone lights up with a number I haven't seen in a long time, and I didn't know why Audra's mom would be calling me on this particular night, 1 month before the 10-year anniversary of her daughter's death, when both the home I left and the home I had created were burning. But then she tells me that earlier that night, while I was busy trying to save everyone that I couldn't, Audra's dad died. And the man who raised me is gone, just like that. I forget what to do with my breath all over again. I call my pastor, the same one I called on the day that Audra died, and he is spending the night at the Bible camp where Audra and I spent the summers before she got sick. I think about our private Jordan, the endless sky, and I cry with my whole body, which is to say that I cry like a 14-year-old girl, like the girl I always will be, and I apologize before I even know that I am doing it. My pastor tells me that his daughter will be 10 years old tomorrow. Think about how everything in my life is connected, how an entire child has been able to grow up between the bookends of my grief, and the connections swirl through my mind until I forget which thing I am supposed to be grieving. I forget to sleep or eat for 3 days, and the music that fills my apartment is the voice of God surrounding me while I sway and scream and dance and wash my feet, and God is talking to me. God is talking to me. God is talking to me. I can hear it so clearly. I call everyone in my contacts. My therapist tells me that I'm having a manic episode, and at this point, I guess bipolar is as good a label as any for my stained glass mind. Call it what you want, but what I know is, in that moment, the curtain between heaven and where I was standing was the thinnest it had ever been. It was real. I could see it. I swear I could. When I say that I want to experience resurrection, my friends come over to hide all my knives and take me to the hospital, where a song by the Grateful Dead is playing softly through the speakers in the waiting room, where a police officer stands watch over my bed, and a doctor with kind eyes draws blood from my train track arm. And I swear that I can feel 10 years of suffering coming out of my body in this too. When the cool rush of fluids arrives in my body to replace the blood I had lost, I think this must be what grace feels like. In the space next to mine, separated by a curtain, I hear the rustling of another body waking up as the doctor in my own room tells me to sleep. And the man next door is waking up from a coma. He had been sleeping for days, the doctor tells him, stitching back together all the things that had happened to him that he couldn't remember. She tells him that he had an overdose, that he had been picked up from a bus stop in downtown Oakland, that somebody had given him Narcan, and he had been sleeping and dope sick for 3 days ever since. She tells him that somebody saved his life. And this is the last thing I hear before finally I'm able to sleep. I wake up on the last day of my mandatory stay at the psychiatric hospital. It is the morning of my 25th birthday. I let myself believe that this is the resurrection I had been waiting for. I tell all of this to my old philosophy professor. I ask him what he thinks it means, like cosmically. He says to me, I think you need to go to seminary. And God is talking to me. I can hear it so clearly. My candidacy committee tells me that I have misunderstood the purpose of the psychological evaluation, that none of this was supposed to be therapy, really, and I know the poem is too long. But how can I tell you about where I am from if I do not first tell you about my elementary school playground, of all the things I found and lost there, and Minnesota Nice, and what it was like to be 14? How can I tell you who I am if I do not tell you first about the places that I have been? About all the girls I was before becoming this woman. I am always afraid that I have said too much, lost too much, felt too much, but I will not apologize, which is to say that I will continue to pray in all the ways I know how.
Lemon ginger tea. There was a moment that changed everything. I got a feeling. You and me and you, me and you and me. I got a feeling. Me and you and me, we go together like honey and tea. Girls like flowers, clever poetry.